it is become so hegemonic, the idea that AI and digital technologies are part of the future and progress, not just economic development, but part of like civilizational development. And that has always been the case with waves of capitalist modernity. These technologies are seen as inevitable. Any resistance to them is seen as, in a pejorative sense, Ludditism.
You're listening to a conversation that is part of the Centre for Future Nature's series on commoning and enclosure. My name is Anushka, and these conversations invite people to explore the possibilities and practices of commons and commoning around the world. Together, we think about plural futures and plural ecologies and the action and struggle involved in creating better futures, which are not only possible, but are already in the making.
My name's Patrick Bresnihan, and I'm an academic. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Geography in Maynooth, which is a university about 40 minutes outside Dublin. And Ireland is my home, and actually the west of Ireland. I'm from Sligo in the west of Ireland originally. And most of my work is focused on Ireland, at least my kind of empirical work, my research, and my activism in terms of that kind of that kind of engagement. But always, I think, trying to think about where Ireland sits within capitalist world system, within histories of international struggle, histories of colonialism, imperialism, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. And I think that that's only become a lot sharper for me, or a lot clearer for me, over the last couple of years with Palestine. And I think that's the case with so many people. Because a lot has sort of come to the surface, or a lot has been sort of clarified or sharpened. So I guess that's part of it. And I think through like my academic work and activist work since doing my PhD, developing relationships with people who are engaged intellectually and through their organizing or activism across Europe and also beyond Europe, those are networks that I really appreciate, and friendships I really appreciate, and exchanges. So I think through that helps keep a lot of my kind of thinking about Ireland and work here kind of linked in with those international conversations and movements.
Nice. The first question I had for you is about a book that you co-authored with Naomi Milner in 2023, and it's titled All We Want is the Earth, Land, Labour and Movements Beyond Environmentalism. And it's a really insightful book. I've now read it front to back and then back to front. And it's really brilliant. And it offers an urgently needed counter history to modern environmentalism from the 1960s to the present day, showing how anti and decolonial thought and praxis are discounted from histories of Eurocentric environmentalism, and also how environmental dimensions of anti-colonial movements and decolonial theory are often understated. And so just to give the listener an idea, the book is woven together with anti-colonial thought, navigating us to a view that sees humans as ecological beings and therefore social justice as ecological and vice versa. The book is shaped by anti-colonial thinkers like Amilcar López Cabral, Sylvia Wynter, Marisol de la Cadena, and Aimé Césaire. And the reference list actually is super valuable in and of itself, I felt. And though many of these activists, scholars and writers may not explicitly be tied to environmental politics, they are, as you and Naomi argue, quote, part of the wider fabric of ideas that demand protection of ecological life as part of a web of land, labour and social relations that must be reconstructed beyond the devastation of colonialism and capitalism, end quote. And there's a quote contained in the book by Pablo Mukherjee, which I felt it illustrates the core message of the book as a whole, which says, if greening post-colonialism seems a strange project, this is only because scholars shaping environmental thought in the 1980s overlooked the high importance on land, water, forest, crops, rivers, and the sea. So, Paddy, it would be great if you could elaborate on how you drew this book together, maybe starting with the title itself and what you hope the readers would take from it.
Yeah, well, thanks, Anushka. You did a really good job of summing up a good amount of the book. It's always nice to hear somebody reads your book because it kind of goes out into the world and you don't hear a lot back. I mean, the title "We Only Want the Earth" comes from a folk song that James Connolly, who is a nationalist, a Republican, a socialist, a labor leader, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist sort of thinker, writer in Ireland, who took part in the 1916 Easter Rising in Ireland and was executed for his part in that uprising. And in 1903, he wrote this folk song with the title, what is the title exactly? I forget.
The title of James Connolly's folk song is referred to as "We Only Want the Earth."
And the gist of it is that, we keep on being told that our demands are we're asking for too much, but all we're asking for is everything, and that's what we should be asking for, and that's what we should be demanding. And I think the reason we chose that as a title, I mean, it came from me, obviously, with me being in Ireland and having that kind of familiarity with that history, and it was partly because of the reference to the earth, which is important, and the idea that it's not just about workers in a kind of in cities and industrial workers, but particularly in the context of Ireland and other anti-colonial struggles, it was about peasants and the land, and always was about the land. That was central. And then also because Connolly was somebody who was very much part of international networks, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist networks. I mean, he himself actually had grown up in Scotland and then come over to Ireland, and there was something about that internationalist sort of exchange of thought and praxis in that period in the sort of early 20th century, which was also very inspiring. So that's why we chose it. But like you said, the book, in terms of its history, focuses from the 1960s up to the present day. And I guess where we were coming from, I mean, Naomi and I are friends first and foremost, and we've sort of known each other since about 2009, 2010. And when we met, there was lots of things that we shared and had interests, including, literature, fiction, our involvement in different kind of movements and activism at the time. We were both doing our PhDs, and then also political ecology and kind of environmental politics. And I think over time, what we found was that there was lots of things that we were connecting and lots of dots we were trying to connect, and different kind of literatures we were engaging with, but there was nowhere that kind of collected all those things. And really the book in one sense is just our attempt, fairly humble attempt, to bring together some of those literatures and to put them down on into one book. And that is partly for teaching, our undergraduate students, postgraduate students, but also for a wider audience, which I think, there is an interest in thinking about environmental politics beyond a very narrowly sort of defined version of what environmentalism or environmental politics looks like. I think there is a frustration with it, even if it's at the level of like nothing's being done. I think that's a fairly widespread feeling. So I think it was partly kind of responding to that too, and trying to be, trying to make an intervention that I don't want to use the word hopeful necessarily, but an intervention that was like constructive in some way, that wasn't just about diagnosing how bad things are, but rather looking to these histories, or these counter histories, if you describe them, of really vibrant movements, intellectual movements, but also social movements and political movements that were about disrupting the status quo of imperialism, colonialism, capitalism, and about trying to construct something radically different. And often those movements were not, as you said, explicitly environmental, but the ones that we're drawing on and talking about linked ecological questions with questions of social justice. And they did that in all sorts of creative ways and interesting ways that are often forgotten and submerged. So it was kind of, and I think more and more I did history as an undergraduate and then as my master's, and I feel like, more and more it like, because there isn't a whole, well, there is now, but there's, when you're looking around, there is something about returning to these histories, these kind of radical histories and insurgent histories that is, for me at least, is always really inspiring, particularly if you take the view that they're not finished, that these are all proposals or promises or projects that were shut down or violently sort of repressed, but they didn't die. And they spread to other places, and their resonances and their kind of energies surface again and again in different places and in different ways. And I think that was partly what we were trying to get at too, is that it's not just a history book, as in we're telling histories of the past. It's more that these currents are still with us.
That's really great. Like also that you mentioned the word resonance, and I've got a question about that later as well, because that's a word that you pick up on in the book specifically. This continuation, as you were saying, and understanding how these movements are ongoing. And there's a chapter about the revolt against one worldism. And towards the end of the book, there's a quote. I'm bringing out a lot of quotes, I realise, in this, from the Indigenous Revolutionary Clandestine Committee General Command of the Zapatista Army for National Liberation, which states that resistances and rebellions, even when silenced and forgotten, show us that the cure, if there is one, is global. It is the colour of the earth, the colour of the work that lives and dies in the streets and barrios, oceans and skies, hills and valleys. Like the originary maize, it has many colours, hues and sounds. End quote. So this quote moves us to think of the revolt against one worldism, a term which you, as I said, dedicate a chapter to in the book. So can you talk a bit about how this revolt can help us to unsettle universal claims embedded in modern environmentalism?
Yeah, that's a big question, but it's a really important one. I think maybe it would be helpful to start with that chapter, the one worldism. And so, a little bit in terms of the structure of the book, it's got four key chapters. And the first one is looking at the kind of 1950s, 60s around sort of struggles around chemicals, in particular pesticides and insecticides, and Silent Spring and Rachel Carson, but moving to Mexico as well, and trying to get away from that kind of focus on Rachel Carson's seminal work in the 60s. And then the next chapter is about one worldism, and it starts with the 1972 Stockholm conference, which was the sort of first international conference that looked at development and the environment. And the third chapter is 1992 and the Rio summit and sort of that period of the 80s and 90s. And then the last chapter is looking at 2010 and kind of debates around the Anthropocene. And each of the chapters sort of takes as a starting off point an event which sort of marks the consolidation of a kind of a mainstream environmentalism, or what we call modern environmentalism. But the point is that you sort of, what we understand today maybe as a kind of a mainstream or environmentalism, one that is, very much compatible with capitalism, one that is very much compatible with genocide, one that is technocratic, largely top down. This form of environmentalism, didn't sort of spring already fully formed in the 1960s. It was contested all the way along. And so we try to show that in that kind of chronology, to show how it took shape and consolidated through different events and different periods. So that in 1972 is important because of the idea of it being this global conference. And I don't know, many of your listeners will probably know about things like the Limits to Growth report, things like the Apollo missions, which showed the Earth for the first time from space, this blue marble, ideas of spaceship Earth. So we're basically pointing to how from the late 60s onwards, you had a way of constructing a global environment through new types of science, new types of technology, types of aesthetics, and also through institutional fora like this summit in Stockholm. And the idea was that, we now have these environmental problems, there is awareness of these environmental problems, and now we all need to come together to try to solve them. But the point about 1972, which is so interesting, is that there was nothing common about politically or socially, economically, um, about that in that gathering. And in fact, it was incredibly contested. The USSR obviously didn't take part, wasn't invited. It was sort of height of the Cold War. Um, there was many newly decolonized countries across the third world that if they were participating on their own terms, where they wanted to develop as the global north, first world had developed, and they weren't going to be sort of cajoled or sort of forced to become these kinds of environmental stewards for the global north, for all the problems that the global north and industrialized north had caused. So it's getting at the point that this idea of some kind of like common sort of or unified environment, today we can think about climate change, which can be the basis for some kind of common political project, is really a problem. Even though it sounds very benign and it sounds like something that we can all get behind, it's always been contested. And that's because often that proposal has come from the first world, the industrialized north, and it's something that is imposed or used as a way to maintain unequal patterns of development and accumulation. And so this idea of the revolt against that is that, okay, well, we can think then about all sorts of ways in which that proposal and that those patterns of uneven development accumulation have been resisted. And that includes the Zapatistas in 1994. It includes many anti-colonial struggles, particularly in that period in the 60s, 50s, 60s, early 70s. And, today we can look at Palestine, and not just Palestine, but beyond. But Palestine is the kind of litmus test or the kind of heart of it, where these systems, which is, of course, Israel is the primary sort of antagonist and target, but it extends far beyond that. And we talk about the US and Europe and these kind of world systems. So I think where the revolt comes from, or why it's important, is that it's challenging the persistence of imperial or imperialist or the capitalist world system, which has obviously changed and taken on different forms, and the center of it has kind of moved from Europe to the US. But for the last 500 years, this system has been taking shape, and there have been revolts and resistances all along the way, predominantly led by indigenous peoples, those who have faced the most violent forms of dispossession and colonization, and even after formal independence continue to suffer the effects of neo-colonialism, whether that's through sanctions or war or unequal trade agreements, structural adjustment. Many different forms are basically reproducing the same kinds of patterns of uneven development. So, I mean, for us, I think trying to think about those revolts as environmental or ecological is because it's about trying to liberate land and resources from those systems, and to different degrees, trying to reimagine how land and labor and resources and ecologies can be organized to different ends, to more socially just ends, to more ecologically sustainable ends. So that's where the revolts come in. The thing I like about that quote and why we have it is that, and it's very much been part of the Zapatista or Zapatismo since the beginning, is it's this idea of one world in which many worlds fit, or one no and many yeses. And so they hold on to the idea that there are many forms of resistance, many kind of worlds that are at stake, but there is still a commonality across those struggles. And that commonality is in identifying and defeating capitalism, and capitalism as a world system, not as something that just exists in one particular nation or something that just involves workers in cities, but something that is a world system. And I think that is very important, that they have that kind of clarity around that. And that quote was sort of at the beginning of launching their Journey for Life, where they made this sort of journey from Mexico over to Europe. And the idea is that they're going to travel around the world. And the idea was that they want to go around the world to meet with struggles and organizations and movements all around the world in order to develop that kind of understanding and to develop that type of, I don't know, fabric, that maybe then, capable of becoming more organized, building up power, and taking steps towards, making a better world for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for explaining a bit more about the pedagogy and ontology. I guess also is really important to go back to that. Perhaps we can move the conversation to data centers, which is something that I know that you've been working on quite a lot in recent years, and that I think it helps encapsulate some of what you've just mentioned. It's a very good case study as to how digital needs, I guess, ranging from e-commerce to cloud storage to streaming services to smart city technologies, these aspects of a capitalist life, and potentially later we can talk about whether these things would exist even in a post-capitalist world potentially, but they power our online lives and allow people to stay digitally connected for friendships, for jobs, for education, transport, and many other things that we might find hard to imagine a life without in our respective context. But in a book authored by Nick Couldry and Ulysses Mejias, this dependency is presented as something more insidious by way of what they call data colonialism. And that's because big data benefits unequally from this digital way of being, making commodities out of this new mode of social life as the raw material for capitalism. And so to emphasize the need for data in this stage of capitalism, the authors reference a 2011 World Economic Forum report that refers to personal data as a resource as valuable as oil. Couldry and Mejias, the authors of this book, they draw parallels between histories of colonial land and resource grabbing to contemporary processes of mining personal data as inputs for capitalist growth. And so the reason why I think it's important to situate the topic of data and data centers that you've been working on against this backdrop is because the ways that data have been popularized as the fuel for the fourth industrial revolution, data dependency is, in the words of the World Economic Forum, quote, merging the physical, digital, and biological worlds in ways that create both huge promise and potential peril. And so I'd like to focus on the peril aspect here to disrupt the image that persists of data being something in the abstract cloud, particularly in relation to the amount of data we consume and its physical impacts on our shared ecosystem. So yeah, I felt like it was quite an interesting segue.
Yeah. I mean, one thing I'd say, going back to the Zapatistas and their resistance, part of Mexico, mountainous part of Mexico, the Chiapas, again, in terms of reading their texts, the metaphor of or image of the vampire, they use a lot of the resources that are extracted from their territory and from Mexico more generally. And these resources are taken out and they are, used to produce commodities that are largely consumed in the US or Canada or Europe. And there's very little goes in. And so there's this idea of the underdevelopment and overdevelopment, where there's very poor social infrastructures, basic infrastructures, but there are infrastructures for extraction, and the wealth that is generated from that accrues to, I guess, sort of comprador class, as well as largely the corporations and investors that own those supply chains. And the core states where those commodities are going to end up and be consumed. And I think that that's important because when we think about the tech industry or digital capitalism, I appreciate the work of people like Couldry and Mejias around this idea of digital or data colonialism and the ways in which we function in our everyday lives as a kind of a resource just by moving. And what right now, in fact, there is data being collected without maybe with our permission, without our particular intentional knowledge, that is being used and can be sold. But I think that those kind of metaphors can also elide or obscure the fact that there are very real material ways in which digital capitalism continue the same kind of operations as the Zapatistas were resisting, which is the actual physical extraction of resources under conditions of, you know, it's colonialism. So if you think about the Congo, we know about coltan and other kinds of metals, and resources that are extracted from there, that is part of a very long lineage going back to rubber and palm oil and slaves that have been taken out of Congo and other parts of Africa. And we can think about e-waste that ends up also in parts of Africa, and we can think about where these things are produced, electronic devices, and so on. So there are still the kind of geographies, the material geographies of digital technologies still replicate these kinds of historical patterns of uneven development and accumulation, which I think is important to also emphasize. And that's where data centers come in. So data centers are one part of that infrastructure, I guess, of the cloud, which includes the coltan that is extracted to make the devices, the factories where they're made, and so on. Data centers are the kind of the storage where all the cloud is stored. And that metaphor of the cloud, in the same way that we think of an Apple computer, it's got this veneer, this aesthetic veneer of being very clean and sleek and immaterial, certainly kind of not as environmentally destructive as other kinds of technologies, but in fact that obscures this very material sort of infrastructure and supply chain. So with data centers, they are these massive warehouses where servers are effectively on racks. So thousands of servers which store and process data. So everything from what's used in our streaming apps, messenger apps, but also the data that's used by the IDF to target, individuals in Gaza, or to maintain particular types of apartheid in the West Bank. So as more and more of our lives and more processes, not just economic or directly economic, but military, state, universities, thinking about the AI, the speculative AI kind of revolution, more and more of that is moving onto the cloud. There is more and more power being consolidated by a handful of tech companies. And that's why it makes sense to talk about them as monopoly tech companies, not big tech or tech industries, but it's monopoly tech. And it's because of the power that they hold, not just in terms of influencing governments or the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Trump and so on, but in terms of the actual infrastructures and resources and supply chains that they now seek to control and manage in order to accumulate more. And I think what's interesting now with the tech industry or monopoly tech is that it's becoming more and more clear that this is very much it always was part, but is more and more part of imperial conflicts and geopolitical conflicts, particularly between the US and China, but also Europe, around control over AI and these technologies, which also includes control over the resources like lithium, like coltan, and also energy. And so the work that I've been doing with Pat Brodie as a colleague for the last 7-8 years around data centers in Ireland, it really just started off being like, okay, there's more and more data centers in Ireland. They use lots of energy. So a kind of an average data center might use the same amount of energy as like a town of maybe 50,000 people or something. But the more we've got into it, the more we have gone in the direction of trying to, on the one hand, think about why Ireland is this place host to so many data centers, and we can get into the details of that. So why Ireland? And then kind of linked to that is, where does Ireland then sit within these emerging sort of supply chains of monopoly tech, and the ways in which it is becoming aligned with these geopolitical or imperialist blocs and their conflicts. And that's interesting for us, not just as a thing to just describe, but it's interesting because within Ireland, then we can see how different types of struggles and movements, for example, to protect our neutrality, or anti-war or anti-militarism or Palestinian solidarity may also link with movements that are opposing data centers on the basis of climate justice, on the basis of their water needs. There are ways in which these, what seem like quite disparate um, and quite sort of localized or discrete struggles, actually have a lot more in common when we understand how data centers fit within this much larger picture. So that's kind of where we're going with the work. And we actually have a book coming out in September, which is called From the Bog to the Cloud, Dependency and Eco-Modernity in Ireland. And it's basically an unraveling of what I've just tried to say to you in a not particularly articulate way, where we start with this question of what is a data center and why does Ireland have so many of them? And we end up with like, we need to build anti-imperialist environmental politics and movements. So via quite a long sort of deep dive into the history of Irish development and capitalism really since the early 20th century.
The thing that I really want to ask you first of all is how did your interest in them develop?
So I was in Trinity at the time, and I mean, most of my work up to that point had been around water and land kind of movements. In Ireland, there had just been the massive movement against the introduction of water charges, and I'd been in Bolivia for a bit of a period of time learning about the water wars there. So water was quite a big thing. And Pat Brodie was in Ireland finishing his PhD at the time, and we both sort of had an interest that was literally just because no one was writing about these data centers. And I had for one of my classes an engineer from EirGrid, which is the semi-state company that manages the grid in Ireland, and he'd come in to give a talk to my class about opposition to wind farms, which is another area of work that I'm interested in, is like renewable energy infrastructure and where it goes and how it's contestation over it. And he was there talking about that, and at the end he just said to me that when he started working for EirGrid in 1990, the key sort of criteria for planning the grid, as in where do we build out the grid, where does it need to be more robust and so on, was around population growth, particularly around regional towns. But he said after 2010, that shifted quite dramatically to the grid being built around the energy needs of data centers. And that was very interesting because data centers they existed from the 90s onwards, but they really became a big thing after the crash. And Ireland, partly because its relationship with the tech industry going back to the 90s, it was quite well positioned to try to develop a capacity for data centers and attract them to Ireland as part of its sort of foreign direct investment sort of strategy. And they were partly taking off because YouTube and a lot of new streaming platforms and just the expansion of the cloud, more and more people online, retail, Amazon Web Services, I think started in 2006 to deal with all the information they were gathering. And so Ireland started getting them, but from 2010 to 2017, there wasn't loads. And then from about 2017-18, it really blew up. So now there's about 90 data centers in Ireland. And it was just fascinating to me, and then talking to Pat, that like, what you were having was this sort of shift in how a nominally public infrastructure, the grid, is being developed and who it's being developed for. And there's not really any scrutiny. It's not really it's seen as just a technical thing. And then we were also just really blown away by how much energy they used, because they're very, they're kind of nondescript. They're warehouses. Like in Ireland, they're mostly around Dublin, around the M50 motorway, which is the ring road. So, it's in industrial zones, and they just look like big storage warehouses. But the idea that, for example, now the most recent estimate is that they account for 21% of electricity on the grid, which is more than all urban households. And by 2030, so by the end of the decade, they estimate it would be about 30% of electricity on the grid. So nearly a third of total electricity on the grid will be going to these server farms where there's very few people employed, and it's just to process that data. And obviously, this is at a time when we need to be decarbonizing and transitioning away from fossil fuels. And a big part of that is reducing energy use. So you have these very clear contradictions, which are being addressed in a very interesting way, which again, I might leave you ask me a question before I keep going, but there's the way in which that contradiction is being resolved is actually opening up a whole set of new questions and contradictions.
I'm really curious to kind of follow the thread of data as something that's consumed and how you specifically and your colleagues kind of question data consumption levels in wealthier nations, like scrutinizing who benefits from the growth of this data infrastructure.
Well, this is where it links to the question of eco-modernity, which is that there is a kind of a technological fantasy or fetish, which is that, you know, not just that the digital age is here, the fourth industrial revolution, but that it's sort of necessary for our transition to a more ecologically sustainable future. And so what you hear a lot about in Europe is this twinned transition, which is decarbonization and digitalization. And that these things kind of go hand in hand. And in Ireland, what that looks like in very material ways is that the tech industry, in response to criticisms of their energy use, have basically stepped forward and dominated the discourse and the policy because they are so close to policymakers. And this goes back to the history of Ireland's foreign direct investment model from the 60s, where effectively our development is determined by the needs of multinational corporations that locate here. A lot of that is about tax, but it's not just tax, it's about infrastructures and resources that they might require. And so what's happening is that they are buying up renewable energy through corporate power purchase agreements. They are positioning themselves as necessary for the decarbonization of the grid. So as the grid moves from reliance on fossil fuels to wind and solar, it needs to become a different kind of grid to deal with uncertain energy sources when the wind blows or doesn't blow and so on. And so these tech companies are moving more and more into energy services because they have such capacity, financial and technological capacity through these facilities. They now have battery storage and generators, and they are kind of seeing that there are commercial opportunities in providing services to the grid. And then they're also doing things like district heating. So there's a scheme in Dublin where waste heat from the data center can be used to heat houses. So again, there's this sort of infrastructural like lock-in. And then they're also with offshore wind, which is the whole new frontier, which is like our Atlantic coast. There's a lot of wind potential. And the data centers are saying, if you don't harness this wind and use it, it's basically a wasted opportunity. So if we can connect data centers to that wind energy, we can turn wind energy into data services, which we can then export. So effectively, we're processing excess wind into digital services that can be sold for money. So this is the kind of like future that is unfolding, and it's really worrying because it is, to talk about themes of your podcast around enclosure and commons, it is a way in which monopoly tech is enclosing the energy transition through infrastructure. It is owning that transition, and it is securing those energy supplies like wind for its accumulation strategies in order to control that energy, because they need more energy. I mean, they need lots of things. They need chips. They need to, they're in competition with China around these kinds of the performance of these technologies. But fundamentally, they need more and more energy. And that is all the more the case with the move towards generative AI, because that is particularly energy intensive. Like streaming is one thing, but the idea of training like language models or any of the kinds of ideas they have for this kind of machine learning that uses huge amounts of energy. And so that's what they're doing. They're strategizing about where we can get energy. And Ireland is a place where they can see that possibility. And there is a very amenable state that is willing to sort of allow that to happen, particularly under the guise of this being about decarbonization and the transition. So going back to your initial question about growth, absolutely, that needs to be challenged. But what is like in terms of that level of discourse, it is become so hegemonic. The idea that AI and digital technologies are part of the future and part of progress, not just economic development, but part of like civilizational development. And that has always been the case with waves of modernity, of capitalist modernity. These technologies are seen as inevitable. Any resistance to them is seen as a kind of in a pejorative sense, Ludditism. You know, we saw that with coal-powered steam engines in the early 19th century. We see that with oil in the mid-20th century. But I definitely think, and this is where it opens up to questions of degrowth and eco-socialism, there's been quite a lot of talk within those movements and in those areas around sort of, you know, agriculture and generally commodity production and, you know, private jets and things like that. But there hasn't been that much in terms of data and sort of the digital tech world. And that seems to be a bit of a blind spot because it is it's not just that there is a lot of data being produced and that has a lot of material requirements. It's that those companies increasingly have so much power that spreads into other sectors. So whether it's fossil fuel exploration, you know, tech companies working with fossil fuel companies to sort of improve their drilling operations, or whether it's tech companies allying with, you know, as I said, IDF or the US military, or whether it's about using automation to undercut jobs, their influence on so much of our lives is it's you know it's terrible, and it needs to be challenged. And it's not just about the data implications; it's about their power. And I think, like I said earlier, where that is now reaching new kinds of terrain is in these geopolitical tensions, particularly between China and the US. And there is a kind of a race to see who can dominate in these technological realms, which is only going to intensify the kinds of demands, say, particularly on Ireland, where what it looks like to control things like offshore wind, subsea cables, and all of that. Then where you start to see is those contradictions are mounting in Ireland, and there are these points of resistance. You know, so for example, there are arguments being made for Ireland to join, if not to join NATO, to join more EU military sort of pacts in order to protect our offshore wind resources and subsea cables, that these are strategic infrastructures for Europe and US connectivity and for the tech industry. And so you can see how the kind of like offshore wind, which is about decarbonization, is linked with energy security, is linked with the tech sector. And Ireland becomes further drawn into this sort of transatlantic military bloc, which is not where I want to be. It's not where a lot of people on the left want to be. And there is then room to develop strategies and efforts to sort of contest that on the basis of wanting a different type of transition, and a different way of using our offshore energy resources and so on.
That's really fascinating. And I wonder, because in Ireland, these data centers are enabled by the foreign direct investment of multinationals like Amazon Web Services, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. And so kind of bringing it to Ireland itself. And because I know that you write in 2023 an article called Data Sinks, Carbon Services, Waste Storage and Energy Cultures on Ireland's peat bogs. And so I'd like to bring it to peat and bogs, because I think with what you were just discussing now about how a lot of the hidden costs of data servers seem to be held in their climate impacts, due to what it takes to power them, but there's also like this ecological displacement aspect to the physical occupation of these servers themselves. And I know that there's part of the sort of so-called just transition away from peat burning in Ireland is all caught up within this idea of like bog reclamation projects and how the offsetting of these data centers are portrayed. And so I think in this article, you said the capitalist growth of already mega corporations for data, whilst inheriting colonial ways of valuing bogs as wastelands that must be put to work for industrial capital. And so I wondered if you could talk a bit about that in relation specifically to like rural peripheralization in Ireland and how what might be perceived as a kind of rural urban divide in terms of development and who's benefiting and whether there's maybe like class sort of critique that could come into this.
Yeah, yeah. No, thanks for asking that because so the book, as you guess from the title, From the Bog to the Cloud, the sort of thread that we draw through it is the bogs, and kind of historically thinking about the bogs as this these places of capitalist modernity, of colonial modernity, but also of resistance. Because Ireland is about 20% made up of peatlands. And from the very beginning, in the 16th century, colonial administrators, were confronted with this type of terrain that was difficult to sort of subdue and difficult to cultivate and difficult to make productive. And it was also a place where rebels used to hide and um, sort of launch resistance from. So there's this sort of long history of bogs being this sort of um, difficult, recalcitrant type of landscape that is also linked up with a kind of anti-colonial struggle, a bit like swamps, maybe a similar kind of idea. But kind of more recently, so yeah, I think that it's important to say that within Ireland, then, with this model of development based on foreign direct investment, Ireland has become very wealthy, particularly since the 90s with the tech industry that has located here. But that model of development is also uneven within Ireland. So Ireland functions within the capitalist world system as a kind of semi-periphery. So multinational corporations use Ireland as a way to siphon off more profit by avoiding tax in countries, say, where production happens. So they can locate here, and we know that it's basically a tax haven. So that's one of the ways in which Ireland functions. But other ways in which it functions is through the provision of resources and infrastructures. And this goes back to the 60s, so when certain kinds of industries would locate here to avail of like cheap labor and lax environmental regulations and access to water and land and resources. And the data centers, in a way, are a continuation of that, or an intensification of that. But what that looks like is that certain parts of Ireland, particularly rural or sort of peri-urban areas where these infrastructures or extractive projects are located, are the ones that suffer from the kind of overdevelopment that comes with this type of extractivist model. So there are places, particularly in the northwest of Ireland, along the border with the north, the west in Connemara, that have long histories of being de-developed or underdeveloped. So they don't have, these are places that, we can think about the famine, that they suffered the famine, the Great Hunger in the mid-19th century, greater than anywhere else. There's the famous line from Cromwell of to Heller to Connacht. It was the place that was sort of left to sort of left to its own devices, essentially. And that sort of persists today with where, for example, large-scale wind farms are, mining projects, Sitka spruce forest plantations. They're in those same kinds of geographies. So there is this sort of uneven geography or uneven development within Ireland and within the island of Ireland, which is also interesting in terms of communities in those places often have solidarity with one another, and there's a long history of there being sort of networks and connections between them. And now with the data center stuff, I might just point to like two examples. So this is another one of those examples that kind of caught Pat and I's imagination, or kind of drew us in at the beginning of our research. It was in 2021, and Amazon Web Services had bought or entered into a contract with a wind farm in Donegal. And it had been widely lauded in the media, including by the then Taoiseach, or Prime Minister, who had said that this showed Amazon's commitment to decarbonisation and alternative energy and so on. And in December of 2021, there was a devastating peat slide at that wind farm. So it hadn't yet been built, but effectively this wind farm, because it was being built on blanket bog, which is a very unsteady kind of geology, because of access roads and building foundations, and there had also been previous sort of disruption because of forestry, access roads and so on, there was this peat slide where effectively the peat bog slid down the hill and completely destroyed a river. And very quickly, Amazon distanced itself from that project. But what it showed was that these sort of clean green commitments of Amazon in terms of its moving to net zero, when you look at what that looks like on the ground, it looks like a catastrophic peat slide because of a massive turbine that should not be built in that place, that is not suitable for that infrastructure. And the campaign, the local campaign they had opposed it on those grounds. But what was interesting is in their campaigns, they had also made the point that this energy was going to an Amazon data center and was not going to power houses, and certainly wasn't going to sort of electrify the local area, which is often those areas are still reliant on solid fuels, like turf and wood and so on. So it really highlighted the kinds of these knotty contradictions of the sort of twinned decarbonisation, digitalisation, of what that looks like when it hits Ireland's sort of historic patterns of uneven development. And that sort of throws up then this question of so who is opposing the expansion of data centres in Ireland? On one hand, you have maybe urban-based climate justice activists, you have environmental organisations, and that's largely because of emissions and because of how much energy data centres consume. But on the other hand, you have at particular points in the actual physical supply chain, as in this wind farm, who were affected by the peat slide, who are making arguments about rural marginalisation, peripheralisation, uneven development. And it maybe is linked to emissions in some indirect way, but they're different types of demand, or they're different types of concern. And I think there's definitely room for there to be a way for these things to be sort of brought together, to converge, and to become about something more than just data centers. Because I think, as you've heard me talk, data centers are a symptom of something. And if you're only targeting the symptom, you're not really, addressing the cause. And the causes run much deeper. And ultimately, to contest that, which is about Ireland's dependency, its relationship with the US, its a long history of this development model based around foreign direct investment. Until there is some kind of alternative, this is what we're looking at, and we need to be thinking about what that alternative looks like, and be thinking about things like development. What is development? Development for whom? Development how? And this goes back to the beginning of our conversation. I mean, that was effectively what has always been within anti-colonial, anti-imperialist struggles. It is about what happens afterwards. How do we construct a different mode of production, a different model of development, once we extricate ourselves from this kind of dependency.
Mm. And have you noticed in Ireland specifically if there have been narratives around, well, firstly, the framing of this as sort of a form of sort of the neo-coloniality aspect, and also do you know of any sort of semi-formulated alternatives in terms of to do with consumption or to do with ownership of these data centers or development?
Not really. And it's hard to it's hard to overestimate how hegemonic the model of foreign direct investment is in Ireland. As in, we are a wealthy country where there is a huge tax take every year, which is corporate tax take. It's not income tax, although that is growing too. But like the share of wealth or tax that comes from workers who are living in Ireland compared to the share that comes from corporation tax, it's a fraction. And so, and this has been the model since the 60s, like very early on. This has been our model of development. And the narratives, which is a very kind of revisionist, liberal kind of modernization argument, which really took off in the 90s with the Celtic Tiger, has been that, this is a success story. And there's no doubt about that. Like in Ireland in the 80s was a very poor country. I mean, it made sense to think about Ireland as having a similar sort of developmental trajectory as other countries that had been colonized, as having much in common with third world countries. And that was also borne out in terms of our solidarity with countries across the global south. But since the 90s and into the EU and the fact that we've become wealthier, the revisionist argument is that, Ireland wasn't really a colony. We're part of the imperial core of Europe, US, and this all sort of pushes towards us becoming part of these like security blocks and so on and so forth. But pushing against that is this sort of, I don't know how to describe it, but there is an undercurrent or a kind of an understanding that Ireland has other alignments, it has other affinities, and that has really blown up with Palestine, and it's really erupted with Palestine. And I think that for many, including those in government, they didn't expect that. And any position that Ireland has taken on Palestine in terms of our government, which hasn't been much, it hasn't taken sanctions, it hasn't introduced basic things like the Occupied Territories Bill, but any kind of statements it's taken or positions it's taken is all because of the fact that they are aware that there is a popular support for Palestine in the face of the genocide and the occupation. And I think that there is something in that has been brought to the surface that relates also to the data centers. So I'll give you one example, which is that every year in November, there is a conference called a Host in Dublin or Host in Ireland conference, which is a massive data center conference. And politicians are there and representatives, CEOs of all the major sort of tech companies and so on. And there's been a protest for the last 3 years, usually organized by Friends of the Earth and other environment NGOs, Extinction Rebellion activist groups. But this year there was people from the IPSC, the Irish Palestinian Solidarity Campaign, and they also spoke outside the protest. And they made the point that these companies that both benefit from corporation relief, tax relief, and also through data centers, and the fact that there are ways in which we don't know what happens in those data centers, but there are ways in which it facilitates these companies that are acting closely with the Israeli government in terms of developing software, providing cloud services for the military. And I think that, and I also made a point at that protest that the other layer of that is that because of subsea cables and energy requirements for the data centers, as I said to you earlier, that's further drawing us into a kind of complicity with kind of US monopoly tech. And that was a very interesting point. I mean, it's just people talking, but the idea that you are starting to link up pro-neutrality, there's very strong support for Palestine, and maybe there is a growing understanding that economic dependency on these tech companies and on the US is undermining those things, and that these things are linked. So our ability to transition towards a decarbonized, more just future is also linked with our capacity to show material solidarity to Palestine and other countries that are being sort of attacked. So I think that, like, to go back to your question, there's no clear proposal, there's no program, but there's a lot of things happening. There have been a lot of protests, there's a lot of activity, but I think that activity isn't particularly well consolidated. It's not particularly well organized. It's maybe not that sustainable. And I think that that's what needs to happen. It needs to become a bit more consolidated. It needs to sort of be clear on how it can articulate these points of connection. And I guess that's something, that I would like to be involved in, or it's where I would like to put energy.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it makes me think a lot actually about going back to this term that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about making things resonate. Because what you were just mentioning there about the IPSC tying Palestine liberation to how that relates to tech monopoly and support for Israel's colonial regime. And I guess in your and Naomi's book, there's a short chapter dedicated to the concept of resonance and eco-social struggles. And this term is described by yourself and Naomi in part as, quote, the sense of connection emerging between disparate things in collectives as opposed to forms of thought that work by implying sameness, end quote, and potentially the flattening of differences.
Yeah.
So maybe, yeah, how do you see resonance potentially unfolding in Ireland
Yeah.
and internationally?
I mean, I think that there's probably two ways that we got to that idea of resonance. One was in trying to figure out in our historical examples that we were looking at, that often we were looking at movements, whether they were intellectual or social or political movements, that were happening at around the same time, but didn't have any formal connection. So, for example, Ken Saro-Wiwa in the Niger Delta in the early 90s, who was part of the Mossop and the Ogoni people who were resisting Shell, Royal Dutch Shell, that had been extracting oil for decades and had been devastating the Niger Delta and devastating the indigenous Ogoni and other indigenous who lived there. That movement, he talks about how he went on a trip, and part of that trip was he went to British Columbia, where there was protests against the felling of old growth trees. And he realized that the environmental question was an important one, and that had a purchase, particularly a purchase with those in the global north. And when they developed the campaign in order to get support for what they were doing, they deliberately appealed to this idea of kind of environmental justice and linked it to civil rights, human rights, social justice. And that was quite a new thing that hadn't been done up until that point. So he was deliberately, or they were deliberately trying to sort of plug into other things that were happening in order to make their demands and their struggle resonate further, to appeal to more audiences, or to gain more support. And that's kind of interesting, because often it's this idea that, like, oh, there's a global north environmentalism, and that's very different to like environmentalism of the poor, or environmentalism of the global south. But in actual fact, like, that's true to a large extent. But there's also a lot of traffic. There's a lot of traffic between, particularly thinking the 60s, 70s, that period of the kind of height of a kind of third worldist project of decolonization, of Pan-Africanism, of black rights, black power. There was so much movement of ideas and traffic of ideas that created this sort of vitality that you couldn't say was like part of a clear organizational program. You couldn't necessarily say that it was even a clear form of solidarity, because maybe they wouldn't know, it wasn't that explicit. So what we're trying to get at resonance is that how do things happen where they can kind of amplify each other without it necessarily being something that's very formalized. And I think, and that doesn't stand in for, I really want to make clear, because people have said this to me afterwards about the book, that idea of resonance doesn't stand in for the work of organization and discipline and building programs and building capacities to actually transform, political institutions and carry out revolution, for example. It's just that it is something that exists. It's something that's happening, and we should be alert to it, that it's something that works. And I think now, where I look around Ireland, for example, where I'm most active or engaged, we aren't really at a moment where there are clear ways to form strong political or social organizations that are able to sort of articulate a common set of demands and politics. We're not there. things are so fragmented and sort of disconnected. So where I feel we need to be, and this is not so much just the historical work, but thinking where resonance came from Naomi and I was thinking about our own landscape of where we're working and active, is maybe being alert to that resonance and trying to work with where there is that resonance. And that IPSC example, that was a small thing. And there's been other little examples of that. And then where you see that, okay, people are forming these connections. And I should also say that there are other things happening in Ireland at the moment that are to do with a resurgence in anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, what would I call it? I wouldn't say a culture, that's too strong, but like in terms of music, folk music, traditional music, Irish language music, there is something kind of organic that is happening, where there is some kind of something exciting happening. And you can't say that it's going to form a political party tomorrow that is going to be an eco-socialist party with like mass support, but it is something happening that has connections with other things. And I think as an activist, or what we're trying to do, talk about with that book, is it's not just to be like, oh, that's nice. It's to think, okay, so there is this resonance. How can we help that converge? How can we help that consolidate? How do we work to try to organize that into a way that then has some kind of collective power to change things?
A key thread in your book is about storytelling, and I feel like the topic of resonance and how you describe it just now and also in the book itself speaks a lot in how we portray and project meaning through storytelling. So in the book, and again, the listeners of this podcast hopefully will be moved to find a copy and pick it up themselves. But the book describes at the beginning a seminal text such as Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and sort of presents it as one that maybe satisfies the need for a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end of an environmental conservation issue, and how to balance the desire for good news ending in state-led salvation, and most commonly a white Anglo-European hero. I wondered whether this is something that you've thought about in relation to who or what is included as environmental politics, and who or what is considered to be at stake.
Yeah, I could say something that I think responds to some of what you said, which is this point about who or what gets to be environmental and who gets to be the protagonist. I think that that's the key thing, is that, moving away from the book exactly, but, where I work, or the context I'm in around things like farming, agriculture, the energy, including the kind of energy infrastructures that are being built. I also am doing work at the moment on retrofitting and kind of decarbonization of housing. And what is very clear and has been clear over the last few years is that the transition, because there is a transition happening, the transition as it is designed and applied is a top-down transition. And it's a transition that is very much about creating new frontiers for capital, new kind of strategies for accumulation, about maintaining growth. And more than that, and this goes back to this point about who is the protagonist, it is that we people are really only participate in that insofar as we buy the product as a consumer, or act as a good environmental citizen, as in we change our individual behavior. And I know that might sound obvious to you and people who work in this area, like, yeah, of course, neoliberalism and individualization and so on, but it is so hegemonic. And I think that the real problem, and where you see movements now in the far right, which is turning, using this kind of anti-environmentalist or anti-environmental rhetoric, is in the sort of sense of frustration and the grievances of having to occupy that position. And obviously those positions are very uneven depending on your class position, your socioeconomic position. They are using that. And even though they're not changing the model of the transition, they're just abandoning transition. they are drawing on the fact that people are frustrated with the way that is. And so I think it's very important for those of us who want a different type of transition, who know we need to decarbonize and we need to take action, that it becomes a popular transition and a democratic transition. And for that to be the case, we need to understand people as protagonists, as the protagonists of social change. And we don't know what that looks like or feels like, especially when I teach my students. It's like they're so far removed from an experience of their own or of histories, movement histories or social change histories where people were protagonists. So I think that the more ways we can tell stories, whether they are small examples or whether they are historical examples of mass movements, of situations where radical change has come about through popular movements, where people are the protagonists. They become political subjects. They become historical subjects. I think the more we can tell those stories, the better. And that will, whether that is in the context of sort of climate or ecology or not, it doesn't matter. It is about that idea of kind of popular transition and popular social change.
Yeah, I also, one of the questions that I was going to ask you earlier, but didn't, was about whether you see there being any potential contestation from right-wing political interest within the situation that's happening in Ireland with the development of energy data complex kind of.
Definitely. It's definitely there. It's happening with the farming. And there's been a couple of kind of they haven't lasted, but kind of far right farming parties that claim to represent, smaller farmers or whatever, that are anti-EU, anti-climate, anti-migrant, that kind of menu of far right populist stuff. And the same with the Nationalist Party, which is not specifically rural. They've, I've seen a flyer it's basically a picture of an old woman freezing in her house, and it says, "This is what the Green Party wants to do with your granny." And on the back, it's this whole thing about how the Green Party and the other governing parties are developing energy for data centers, and they don't care about the people, and they're going to let them freeze. And it's really kind of scary reading that, because it's not far removed from my critique, in the sense that our energy transition is being owned by monopoly tech and it's not being developed for people. And so it really makes you think about how the intervention cannot just be a critique of that model. It has to be about the proposal, as weak as it is or as unlikely it is, of a public energy system, for example, or a democratic transition, or a just transition from below, or whatever terms you want to use. But it can't just be a kind of anti-data center, anti-Green Party thing.
Well, yeah, exactly. I guess it goes back to what you were saying about looking at the symptoms and not thinking about the deep set, like systemic root cause of it. And back to what you were talking about with the Zapatistas and understanding it as a global world system. And that, as you said, the kind of diagnosis of those symptomatic kind of issues,
Yeah.
depending on who is set as the protagonist, and kind of this often populist imaginary around that can either lead you looking to far right narratives around what's going to solve it.
Yeah. But I think that one thing, and that relates back to the book, in terms of a way to orientate yourself in that critical analysis, is to look at resistance, and resistance in its many forms. But rather than just looking at the system, and it's very important to do that kind of analysis of systems and structures, but there is always resistance, and in that resistance there is joy and humor and feeling, and that's a kind of an endlessly hopeful thing.
And actually, on that note, I wondered if you had any specific people, organizations, maybe readings like
one actually, because it's kind of it's happening at the moment, but in the Sperrin Mountains in County Tyrone, there has been a decade-long campaign against a proposed gold mine. So it's a Canadian company called Dalradian who want to develop a gold mine just there close to the border. And Save Our Sperrins is the group that have resisted it. And they have a kind of a camp or HQ at Greencastle, which is this amazing place. In fact, I mention it in the book, or we mention it in the book, because the Zapatistas came to visit there in November 2021, and it was a really moving situation where there was 8 women from the Chiapas Zapatistas, and then there was the Sperrin community, and there was a translation from indigenous language into Spanish and then into English, and they had this really amazing dialogue where they were learning from each other's struggles. But there's a public inquiry finally that started, I think, in December, or maybe even in the beginning of this month. But that public inquiry in the north is to see whether they're going to get be able to do the development. And they've recently had to freeze the public inquiry because the Department of Infrastructure didn't carry out a cross-border environmental assessment, or they didn't notify the government in the south that they needed to carry out that assessment. So they're being as effective as they can, using the kind of delaying tactics to sort of just trip up Dalradian, which is this massive mining company with, massive investors that wants to get this 20 or 30-year lease to just mine all this gold, which will be devastating for the area, which is a special area of protection. And now it's open to the south, so there's going to be a consultation, hopefully. And it's interesting because there is also, as I said earlier, about north and south, these things that are happening. There is there's a real sense of a kind of all-island environmental justice movement now, which is, I think, a really important thing. And there are lots of, I think there's something like nearly 400 prospecting licenses given to about 40 mining companies in the south of Ireland. And that's all under the heading of the kind of EU Critical Minerals Act, because this idea of trying to onshore critical minerals for the green transition. So again, it's a place where there are these contradictions, where the green transition requires these resources, and what does that look like on the ground, and who is resisting it. So if readers or listeners wanted to look at Save Our Sperrins and follow their campaign and support it in any way they could, that would be great. They're amazing, amazing people who have just been doing it for so long and they just have such humor with it. People can look there. And then one other thing I'd mention, because it's a really nice thing, is that the book, We Only Want the Earth, has been translated into Turkish by a Turkish collective called Pollen. And they do kind of political education around environmental politics and capitalism and imperialism and all sorts. And people can check out their website. It's POLEN. And we're hoping that there will be a launch of that translation in London in May. And I'm going to hopefully come over for it with Naomi, and there's some Turkish comrades, friends in London who maybe will host it. And we can use it as a way to sort of generate conversation around Palestinian solidarity and things like that.
You've been listening to an episode of the Future Natures podcast. We've been talking to Patrick Bresnihan, co-author of the book All We Want Is the Earth, Land, Labour and Movements Beyond Environmentalism. You can find links to the many references made in this conversation in the show notes, where you can also find out how to keep up to date with future episodes. Until next time.